Hello class, welcome to Basics of Biblical Archaeology. We're going to look into, in lesson 10 here, a topic that's very important known as the pre-1400 BC offset. A lot of people have talked to me and asked me questions about radiocarbon or carbon-14 evidence and what role does that play in ancient history. So we need to kind of spend a little time going into chronology and seeing how this can help us then to understand the world of history better. If you remember, when we talked before about history and archaeology and the relationship and how archaeology actually serves history, that its role is a servant's role, because the greater issue is understanding the history behind something. I mentioned that there are lots of other disciplines that feed into this understanding of history. The sciences are all part of that, and as archaeology has evolved, archaeology has become much more science-based. So we're testing the bones to determine length of life, what killed a person, what the person's DNA was like, and so forth. So there are lots of ways in which sciences have come into the study of ancient Near Eastern history. And we want to take advantage of that as archaeologists. So part of that is chronology. We really need to be able to understand the relationship of chronology to history. And if we're going to, with using archaeology, connect it to biblical history, which again is part of the umbrella up here, we have to approach it with the right chronological understanding. And what we're going to find out is that radiocarbon evidence is valuable and reliable as you go back in history from our time to a certain point in time, and that point is 1400 BC, which is roughly the time that Moses dies. And before that, the radiocarbon itself does not always match, in fact, it always doesn't match what we would know from archaeological and historical means to be able to date things with confidence. So let's look at the problem. First of all, we want to start with an Old Testament archaeological scheme. That's the result of the kind of conclusions that are drawn that help understand how the biblical history and chronology fits with the ancient Near Eastern history and chronology. So about 3168 is the year for the flood. We can be confident about that, especially with a proper understanding of the textual variants in Genesis 11. About 2650 or so is the right time for the Tower of Babel events, which is going to go into my new book, which I'll allude to in a minute. And then Nimrod is about 2320, and I will attempt to prove in that book that Nimrod is equal to Sargon of Akkad, a historical figure who is known to us. And then the birth of Abraham in 2166, and we've already talked about some of these other dates. So, with that chronological scheme, I want to refer you to a few sources that are going to be useful to you for reading. One of them is an article by Jeremy Sexton and Henry Smith on the chronology of Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, and really the textual variants were there. Some years ago, I met with Henry and I told him about my research that I was doing on this, and I let him know that the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls reading of the chronology of Genesis 11, those textual variants are probably correct, and the Masoretic Hebrew text is probably incorrect there. So he kind of took that and ran with it and worked with Jeremy Sexton and made up this article. Now, I'm going to deal with this myself in a book that's not yet completed called The Forgotten Era, Illuminating Biblical History from the Tower of Babel to Abraham. And in that book, I will have my understanding of these issues there. And then an article that's already out, you can read Roger Young's article called Usher Explained and Corrected. What Roger Young does with this article is he demonstrates why the chronology of Bishop Usher, that's several hundred years old, which is followed by a number of people, it's flawed for a number of reasons in a number of ways. And actually the work of an Adventist who's now deceased in the 20th century, Edwin Thiele, that work essentially supplanted and corrected all of the mistakes of Ussher. And basically it introduced kind of a new framework for understanding chronology. And Thiele's work was far beyond what anyone has ever done in chronology. So that's an important source, Roger Young's article that refers to the work of Edwin Thiele. All right, now let's talk about radiocarbon evidence after 1400 BC. So first thing I want to do is try to prove to you that when we match up biblical chronology with the radiocarbon evidence, and as long as these are events that are datable to before 1400 BC, they match. So it's a mistake for Christian believers to throw out radiocarbon evidence carte blanche, or to look for some kind of reason to debunk it because it's harmful to your understanding of biblical chronology. That is a mistake, a very, very important and tragic mistake that we don't want to make. We want to understand it correctly. So let's start here. The fact that the Bible requires the age of the earth to be under 7,500 years old, according to biblical chronology, presents a problem, given that radiocarbon dating yields evidence of life forms that lived even longer ago before that. So that's the problem. How do you deal with it? Given that historians now can date ancient events with an even greater level of confidence, going back even further in time than could be accomplished in previous decades, the question comes as to whether carbon-14 dating is accurate at all with datable points in antiquity. Since Israelite chronology is that of only one ancient Near Eastern people group who carefully kept chronological records, the question can be asked whether these various chronologies coincide with carbon-14 evidence or not, because the Israelites were so careful in their dating and so specific in their dating. We can put points on the absolute timeline, thanks especially to what we know from Neo-Assyrian chronology, because it's also very specific and it mentions events that we can peg on the absolute dating timeline. The first test to make is whether biblical chronology after 1400 BC matches well with carbon dating for organic matter that dates to the same time frame as datable events in Israelite history. And the first test that we're going to look at relates to an Israelite site that was occupied for only about 25 or 30 years. And that's really helpful. If the site was occupied for only a short period of time and we use radiocarbon analysis on it, it can become all the more effective. But Khirbet Qeiyafa is a site known to overlap between the reign of King Saul and that of King David. So in Arabic, it's known as Khirbet, which is a ruin with exposed artifacts or remnants of the actual occupation back in ancient history. And its name in the Hebrew Bible is dual gates. There's a Hebrew word for this that's sha'arayim, and sha'arayim essentially means dual or twin gates. And we can find a reference to that in 1 Samuel 17:52. The Israelites camped there when David met Goliath, and it's known that David became king over all of Israel in 1002 BC. So there's our tent peg from biblical chronology. 1002 BC is either the exact year or right within a year or two of the year that David would have conquered Jerusalem and took over as king over all of Israel. So when we look at the radiocarbon evidence, though, for the site of Khirbet Qeiyafa, here's what we see. We see that there's a median date with relation to the destruction, because the destruction point for that site is very clear and specific. And so organic matter that had, so some kind of organic life that had died was found at this point, and it's very datable, and these are seeds. So the range is here, and the median date in the range and radiocarbon evidence doesn't provide a specific single date, it provides a range of years. And the median date for this is 988 BC, and this is with a fairly high degree of probability. So that being the case, the 17 olive pits that were used for this analysis allow us to focus in on this time range that, again, the median date for which is 988. And so it's probably only going to be a short distance one way or the other from 988 as to when this site was destroyed. And if the archaeologists are correct, and they almost certainly are, that the site was only occupied for 25 or 30 years, then that helps us to be able to know when the destruction is and therefore when it was founded. And if we know something in biblical history that matches, and we do, that's David's coming onto the throne, then it all fits together. As for the earliest attested date for organic material found at Caiapha 4, and that's the level where this occupation occurred for this 25 or 30 years, roughly in 1000 BC. The excavators found numerous samples throughout the site, some of which address this question. Most samples taken record probable date ranges that fit best within the first quarter of the 10th century BC. For example, seeds that are designated Caiapha 5 and Caiapha 6 and Caiapha 7 and Caiapha 10, which justifies Garfinkel's conclusion, and Garfinkel is the chief excavator at the site, his conclusion that the site was inhabited for at least part of David's reign in that century. But several samples fit best overall in the last 2 decades of the 11th century BC. For example, olive pit designated Caiapha 3, taken in year 2008, excavated in locus 214 in area B. This one dates to the range of 1211 to 1011 BC with a 95.4% probability, and to 1130 to 1046 BC with a 59.6% probability. What this shows you is radiocarbon evidence for this one olive pit, the sample Caiapha 3. And you can see that it's 1130 to 1046 with 95% probability and 1211 to 1011 with 95% probability. So this is the actual plate from the research that was done by the scientists who examined this. For another example, the burnt olive pit designated Caiapha 1B, taken the same year, acquired from a fireplace in the casemate of Building 2 in part of Locus 214, dates to 1132 to 974 BC with an 88.6% probability, and to 1114 to 1014 BC with a 68.2% probability. So again, these are more olive pits, but now we're looking at olive pits that aren't from the destruction level, but overall found within the site. For a final example, the olive pit designated Caiapha 9, taken in 2009, excavated in locus 383, dates to 1126 to 922 BC with 95% probability, and 1056 to 974 with a 53% probability. Given that David became king of Israel only in 1002 BC, Caiapha 3's date range suggests that the site was occupied for some length of time before David ruled the nation, as the chance is greater than 95% that the olive was taken from its tree by 1011 BC. This supports the idea that the site was founded during Saul's reign, which Saul's reign we know is approximately 1049 to 1009 BC. While the probability is almost 60% that Caiapha 3 dates to before 1046 BC, this probability is hardly binding. If so, it would roughly triple Caiapha's length of occupation, which Garfinkel's team justifiably limited to 20 to 30 years. So the fact that the archaeology makes it clear that it's a very brief occupation helps us to kind of put fence posts out there that help in evaluating the radiocarbon evidence. So some seeds are going to provide evidence that's a little more far outlying, and others are going to be closer to what you would expect. The carbon 14 evidence from Caiapha thus fits well with historical and archaeological dating, suggesting that the site of Dual Gates was built in approximately 1020 BC, occupied for about 30 years per Garfinkel. So if we go on the larger extent of that, we would say it'd be about 30 years for the time range. And then Caiapha was destroyed in about 990 BC, a mere 2 years after the radiocarbon evidence's median date. So what I'd suggest to you, from evaluating the radiocarbon evidence and evaluating that with biblical chronology, which we can be fairly certain about, they match up extremely well, and they suggest to us that, number one, we can confirm that 1002 BC, which is the biblical date for David taking over as king, and at that point a new phase was instituted in the material culture right about the time that David's reign begins. It's a transition from what we call Iron Age 1B to Iron Age 2A. And the site itself gives evidence of this transition time. A little bit of time before and a little bit of time after. So all of the evidence fits together perfectly to suggest that the radiocarbon evidence and the biblical evidence for the destruction of Khirbet Qeiyafa in around 990 BC, it fits perfectly. So radiocarbon evidence at this point is reliable, and that's an important note to make. So at 1000 BC, radiocarbon evidence, when compared with biblical chronology, lines up pretty much perfectly as we would want or expect. The second test that can be offered relates to the Neo-Assyrian invasion of Jerusalem, when Sennacherib invaded the kingdom of Judah and captured 46 cities, as he claimed in his annals. Historical dating, thanks to confident synchronisms between Neo-Assyrian chronology and Judite chronology, provides a date of exactly 701 BC for the time that Sennacherib, the king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, planned his conquest of Judah's capital, and he was already in Judah capturing cities, and Jerusalem, of course, was the cherry on top. The Bible indicates that Hezekiah, who reigned from 716 to 687, built a water shaft in anticipation of the Assyrian siege by Sennacherib. What does radiocarbon evidence have to say about the tunnel's dating, given that this tunnel carving captured plant matter? In other words, a little bit of plant matter was trapped inside when they carved out the tunnel before they coated it with plaster, or while they were in the process of doing that. Somehow a little bit of plant matter got stuck against the wall that they had carved out, and then the plaster was applied, sealing that plant matter against the wall. So here's an image of Hezekiah's tunnel, a cutout, if you will. So here is the city of David, and this is the main part of the population of Jerusalem at the time in about 71 BC, although they were certainly to the west of it as well. And you can see from this larger image that lots of houses were built to the west of the earlier wall. But the water source is down here for Jerusalem's water. The Israelites, the Judites who were there, they obviously needed water to drink if they were going to be under siege by the Neo-Assyrians. And obviously, if the Neo-Assyrians could hold out and wait, thinking that they would run out of food and water, then the Israelites or the Judites would have to surrender. So they had to get water into the city, and so that's why Hezekiah had this tunnel built. So here's where he had the tunnel built, and it extended all the way down into the lower portion of the city. And obviously, you're working with gravity if you're a construction engineer, in this case, a civil engineer. So they engineered it to bring the water to this point, to the southern tip of the city. So that was what had to be done, and they carved this tunnel very quickly, and it led from the Gihon spring right there all the way down here to the pool of Siloam. And this is an image showing you the very waterway itself, and obviously a camera with a flash had to be used to show it, but it's very revealing because it was taken while walking through this water tunnel that Hezekiah ordered to be carved into the limestone. And this glossy texture that you see on it here on the walls, that betrays the presence of plaster. And so that plaster, of course, was put there at the very time, it had to be put there at the very time that the tunnel was carved. Otherwise, water would be leaking, would have leaked out in antiquity and never would have stopped leaking out. So a plaster prevents any kind of leakage. The article Radiometric Dating of the Siloam Tunnel, Jerusalem, from 2003, was published in Nature magazine, a very technical but important article on this very thing. a geologist and his colleagues found this plant matter, these samples of plant matter, under this plaster lining that was laid down in the tunnel when it was first built. Plant matter that was trapped inside this waterproof layer dated to, according to them, and these are their words, secular researchers, dated to 700 BC or slightly earlier. They wrote, "We conclude that the biblical text presents an accurate historic record of the Siloam Tunnel's construction." Aha! So they're convinced that the radiocarbon evidence matches up with the biblical evidence. 701 BC according to the Bible, and it's around 700 BC or slightly earlier. And again, with radiocarbon, we're looking at a date range, but that's how the evidence would be presented. Virtually any organic matter dated to after approximately 1400 BC by radiocarbon testing, where we can confirm or test whether or not biblical chronology stands up against the test of scrutiny, it matches the archaeological historical dating scheme. So these are two examples, in 1000 BC and in 700 BC, examples that show that the Bible, with its chronological record, and the secular study of radiocarbon evidence from matter that dies and decays at a very consistent rate over time, that evidence holds up to verify that after 1400 BC, the two match very well. With proof that biblical chronology after 1400 BC matches ideally with carbon-14 evidence, the question arises as to how ancient historians have found other cultures' chronology to match up with it. So we can scrutinize biblical chronology, but let's scrutinize ancient Near Eastern history and chronology with other cultures. And for that, we're going to go before 1400 BC. Essentially, there are no problems between Neo-Assyrian and other ancient Near Eastern peoples' chronologies with any organic matters dating to the first millennium BC. So just like with biblical chronology and biblical history, with a study of the other ancient Near Eastern cultures, after 1400 BC, they once again match. If there's any radiocarbon evidence and a date is known as a fixed date on the absolute timeline, they have an almost perfect match. So just like with 1000 BC and 700 BC in the Bible, we have that same consistency. However, a problem arises with the matching of any carbon-14 samples to archaeological historical chronology before 1400 BC. The Egyptologist Manfred Bitock, who was the chief excavator at Avaris for over 4 decades, is the one who really documented and discussed this first and at greatest length. And here's what he says. In summation, the agreement between carbon-14 and historical chronology, that's what we looked at, where there are historical ways of dating things that we know about that can give us dates on an absolute timeline. And in the 14th century BC, and the sharp rise of an offset a century earlier of up to 100 to 150 years, as well as in the preceding centuries, meaning before that, in the centuries before that, you have that same offset. In other words, they don't match up. When you have a date that you should know, as history and archaeology can tell us, this is the date, and chronological tests other than radiocarbon evidence, that they give us a fixed and concrete date. If we go earlier than, and down is back in time, if we go earlier than 1400 BC, all of a sudden there's an offset, and they don't match up. So that's a problem. And this is up to 100 or 150 years, as well as these preceding centuries. And that only shows that the calibrated radiocarbon dates presented by the scholars who published this cannot be considered as a series where the precision seems to deviate considerably from the 15th century backwards. This conclusion is the more cogent one as within the historical chronology of the 18th dynasty, with its dense network of renal and genealogical data, nobody could claim that a mistake of more than 100 years could have mounted up from the Amarna period to the early Thutmosids within a century. In other words, there's no way that our understanding of second millennium history, ancient history, could be so far off that we're off for 100 years or 150 years, or as we go back further, 200 years or 300 years. There's no way it can be off that much. It's not possible. Under such auspices, he says, one has to ask if it would not be worthwhile to investigate if a systemic failure in the Mediterranean carbon-14 evaluation could be discovered. In other words, we have to find some kind of problem, and maybe there's a problem related to the Mediterranean world and our understanding of this process. Or if the absorption of carbon-14 was, and according to him, for environmental reasons, different from the 15th century backwards. And really, that's the root of the issue. Probably we do not know what may affect radiocarbon and its evaluation process. So this is wonderful. He presents this massive problem that very few people, even those who have studied ancient Near Eastern history, Christians who educate themselves, even teachers at Bible college and seminaries, don't understand this issue. And the issue is not confined to Egypt alone, but it's throughout the Mediterranean, ancient Mediterranean world. But the problem is that when we test with radiocarbon evidence, it all matches up fine until you get to 1400 BC, and then you begin to have this gradually increasing offset as you go back earlier in time. But he made this point, or he asked this question, or if the problem is that the absorption rate of carbon-14 was, for environmental reasons, different from the 15th century BC backwards. So that's the question. That's the research question. Could it be that there is a standard that we have today, and we can test, and it shows up consistently every time, that there is a standard decay rate for organic material that died after 1400 BC? There seems to be there's the possibility that the rate of radiocarbon decay is standardized as we go back in time all the way to 1400 BC, and then maybe it goes off, and maybe we don't have the right understanding of the decay rate, and it was different before 1400 BC. And according to Bitok, there's no way that the answer for this is known and can be demonstrated or proven by secular science or secular-led ancient Near Eastern history. So this chart basically shows you this offset where you have, this is 1300 BC, 1400 BC, 1500, 1600, 1700. Here is, in the Egypt and the Levant, the Cypriot chronology. Here, and that's Cyprus. And then here's the Cypriot historical chronology. Here's the Aegean historical chronology. And then here's carbon-14 evidence with matter related to the Aegean. And here's carbon-14 evidence in matters related to Cyprus. So the last two columns are radiocarbon, and these three columns are historical archaeological dating. So they should match up as they go along. And you see that the first three columns more or less match, match, and match. But if you start bringing in the radiocarbon evidence, it matches before 1400 BC, so up to this point, from our time up to this point. But we're going back in time, once we hit 1400, now we're seeing an offset where these areas are showing that it's older than it really is. LM1A is here on the radiocarbon, but here with historical chronology. LM1B is here with radiocarbon, but here with historical chronology. LM2 is here, but here with historical chronology. And you can see that as you go back in time, it's stretched out. And the offset, the imbalance, the non-match becomes greater the farther you go back into history. That is what scientists have been able to demonstrate. And we need to understand this, and it has to help form our understanding of the value of radiocarbon dating. And again, all of this work is not presented by Christian apologists who have a view to uphold. It's presented by average, everyday, very competent ancient Near Eastern historians, archaeologists, and scholars. So, This carbon-14 anomaly before 1400 BC and appears at locations other than Egypt. For example, throughout the eastern Mediterranean. One such location is the site of Jericho that we already looked at in an earlier lesson, which is in the Jordan Rift Valley. For Jericho of the early Bronze Age, radiocarbon dates are 150 to 300 years older than conventional archaeological assessments. Now, the early Bronze Age is going back further in history. So we're talking about towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC. We're no longer around 1400, 1500, 1600 BC. We're talking much earlier. And there, according to this, the offset is 150 to 300 years. That's how large the offset is. So it's increasing exponentially as it goes back in time. And that's according to an article in the Radiocarbon journal, which is very reliable science. The same radiocarbon-14 anomaly at Jericho occurs for the late Bronze Age. So not just the early Bronze at Jericho, but the late Bronze at Jericho also, when City 4 was destroyed, and that's the city that's destroyed under Joshua, just after the Israelites crossed into Canaan. Radiocarbon dates for the destruction of Jericho City 4 are given in Bruns and van der Plicht, Tel es Sultan, Jericho, radiocarbon results, etc. That's 1995. Results of carbon-14 dating of serial samples from Jericho are 3,306 plus or minus BP. Now, applying the 1986 Oxford calibration curve gives an equal probability for the 1 sigma range as either 1601 BC to 1566 BC or 1561 BC to 1524 BC. Given that Jericho City 4's destruction dates to 1406 BC, the radiocarbon dates are 120 to 160 years too early. So here's the thing, the same problem that the secular archaeologists found with other sites throughout the ancient Near Eastern world, Egypt and in the Levant and other places, that same offset matches or is present if you evaluate Jericho's radiocarbon evidence. So that the consistency, it needs to be understood with consistency. If we're going to be over 100 years off in one place, it shouldn't be a surprise that we're over 100 years off in another place. So what you can then do is take into account this offset to be able to correct the radiocarbon specific dates. So if we can fix the dating for these other places in the ancient Near East, we can also fix it for Jericho. The most important subsequent resource on this subject is Radiocarbon and the Chronologies of Ancient Egypt, which is a book that came out, Oxbow book, in 2013. The book, on page 95, cites many sites with carbon-14 anomalies: Jericho, Khirbet Batrawi, Tel Abu el-Kharaz, and other sites. Pre-1400 BC dating is problematic, and it's consistent in its problematic nature. Another problem created by the carbon-14 anomaly is the overdating of the length of archaeological periods. Also on page 95 of the Oxbow book is the statement that researchers reported in 2011 that the dates of the early Bronze Age 3 in Canaan, Israel, reach from 2900 to 2400 BC, which is a huge span of 500 years, 200 years longer than standard dating allows. So what does that mean? It means we can not only look at an individual life form that dies and say, okay, it died in what year, how does that fit historical chronology, and how does it fit radiocarbon evidence? But with radiocarbon evidence, we can then determine a range for an entire archaeological period, because we can date various organic material from the beginning of it, the middle of it, the end of it, and it gives us a range. And the range, according to radiocarbon evidence, is 500 years, whereas according to historical dating, we know it should be only around 200 years. So the offset is not only consistent throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, but it's consistent with making date ranges of archaeological periods appear to be too big when instead they should be shorter. So there is a complete consistency in all of this. So here's the question. What could account for this consistently increasing offset in the comparison of historical chronology dating versus carbon-14 dating as one moves further back in time from 1400 BC? There's no satisfactory answer that can be provided by the study of ancient Near Eastern history. Bitak already admitted that. We just don't know what it is. And when he was asked at a conference that I and Bryant Wood and Roger Young attended, and I think it was in 2012 or 2013, it was in Chicago, he said, when asked about this in front of an entire audience, he said, "We're not sure what it is. Perhaps it was fog. Fog is to be the culprit for this anomaly." But that doesn't explain how it interacts with radiocarbon evidence on one level, but on another level, it doesn't explain how the offset becomes increasingly worse as you go throughout ancient Near Eastern history to earlier times. So it's not an answer that can work. But perhaps there is a satisfactory answer that can come from biblical history. Maybe the only logical solution to the pre-1400 BC radiocarbon anomaly is found in an illumination of biblical history and chronology. And that starts with ages of pre-flood and post-flood patriarchs. According to the Bible, the ages of the patriarchs decreased after the flood. Before the flood, you had long spans in the hundreds of years for life, including Methuselah, who lived 969 years. But as soon as Noah comes along and the flood occurs, the lifespans start to decline gradually over time. That's very important. So that's one thing we observe from the text. Then there's the effects of radiation on a post-flood Earth. So the fact that the Earth has experienced this global flood, it shows signs in the text that things became different after the flood. For example, all of a sudden there is the institution of the concept of a system of seasons, where a year is divided now into 4 seasons, where it's a coldest season, it's a cool season that warms, and then there's a hot season, and then there's a season that's warm that turns to cool. So there's a 4-season system instituted, which suggests that there are forms of upheaval on the earth that are being experienced after these catastrophic processes that Christian geologists have demonstrated occurred after the flood. So there is the potential with this for a change in the radiocarbon decay rate. So it's possible that the decay rate of radiocarbon was different before the flood, and that after the flood, just like we have the patriarchs' lifespans that gradually decline, it's possible that the decay rate gradually changes until a point where it stops changing and normalizes and kind of looks like a line on an EKG. When someone dies, it's a flat line, right? And it just becomes a flat line for history beyond that. And it's possible that this normalization of radiocarbon decay coincides with the death of Moses in approximately 1406 BC. Moses lived 120 years. There's only one other person that's spoken about in the Bible that I know of who lived 120 years after Moses. But nobody lives longer than 120 years. What's the importance of this? God predicted in Genesis 6, in relation to all of the events that were happening on earth that made God realize He needs to start over. He needs to hit the reset button. So with that, when He looked at man and saw this utter tendency toward evil and greater sinfulness as mankind aged, God determined that as for mankind, his time will be 120 years. And that was a statement made to inform Noah and anyone who would listen what things would be like in the future. Mankind would only live 120 years. God would not put up with him for 969 years anymore. God would limit mankind's life to a period of time that's less than that. So, and of course with God, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So he didn't have to implement that 120-year lifespan immediately the moment Noah walks off the ark with his family. It could have been the case that God decided it would be a gradual lessening of the lifespan of mankind. But isn't it ironic that that move down toward 120 years seems to normalize and take place, right, where we have this dynamic, this prophetic word of God, that 120 years will be the lifespan. Right around Moses' lifetime, that's when we see there's this stoppage of lives that are older, people who live longer than 120 years. So the biblical history and chronology seems to fit well there with what we see and observe with this change in the radiocarbon decay rate at around 1400 BC. Again, the very same time that Moses dies. This theory was presented, in my theory, to Dr. John Baumgartner of ICR, who's a key figure in the 8-year research project called RATE, Radioisotopes of the Age of the Earth. And here is what Dr. Baumgartner replied when I presented him with this case. He said, most definitely, our conclusions suggest that the renormalization, as you are calling it, of the atmospheric carbon-14 level during that interval between the flood and about 1500 BC should have been smooth, or to use your word, gradual. Yes, our conclusions definitely imply that the older the actual age, the greater the difference ought to be between the actual date and the date provided by radiocarbon measurements. So the study done by the RATE project, independently of any research of mine, it became consistent with this offset as you go further back in time. The archaeological community is divided, with conservatives such as BTOC favoring historical dating over carbon-14 figures when going back beyond or before 1400 BC. On the other side, the less seasoned, science-oriented members of the community advocate the correction of historical dating with numbers produced by carbon-14 dating. So in other words, they look at the evidence, the carbon-14, and they say, this is science, and because it's science, we have to accept it. And so our whole 150 or 200 years of study of the history of the ancient Near Eastern world, we can turn it on its head and just erase it like on a chalkboard and start over with radiocarbon evidence. But seasoned scholars such as BTOC scream out and say, no, we just can't do that. You can't just wipe away. You can't just extend time as you go back in history to fit this evidence when the evidence consistently contradicts what we know to be true from archaeological historical dating. In the Oxbow 2013 volume on carbon-14 dating and chronology, one writer said that the chronology proposed by Hornung and other scholars in 2006 is probably too low and should be corrected upwards by about 150 to 200 years. Without consulting biblical history, no resolution will come for the advocates of these two sides. So really, we're dependent upon something other than what we find in ancient Near Eastern history to solve the problem of the pre-1400 BC offset in the radiocarbon evidence. The offset is there. You can't erase history. You can't just stretch things out when we know by other means that they can't come into, that it doesn't work to use those numbers. So you have to find some answer to the problem. And really, ultimately, I think, and I'm convinced, the only answers found within biblical history. The same kinds of things and dynamics that take place in the book of Genesis are confirmed through what's found by science where we have this pre-1400 BC offset. So, at the end of the day, radiocarbon evidence is reliable 1400 BC and later, but anything before 1400 BC, it becomes consistently off and exponentially becomes off as we go back further into time. So the Bible itself provides the only answer to this problem, and this will help us in our study of the archaeology of the ancient Near Eastern world. Thanks for joining me.